So the next method we are going to look at is the net present value method. How do we calculate our net present value? We take all of our future cash flows, we discount those future cash flows using the company's weighted average cost of capital. We then deduct the cost of the investment and you will be left with your net present value. Now, please note, guys, this method is superior to all other methods. So this is better than calculating the payback period, and it is also better than the internal rate of return method. Why is this method superior to all other methods? Firstly, it takes time value of money into account, which is very important when we are looking at long-term decision making. Second, it assumes that all cash flows received from the investment will be reinvested at the weighted average cost of capital, and this is the correct reinvestment assumption. We are going to discuss this in a little bit more detail when we get to the internal rate of return method. So for now, I just want you to make a note that we are going to come back to this later. And lastly, it selects investments which maximize shareholder value. So if you are required to discuss why the net present value method is superior to all other methods, those are the reasons why. Let's look at an example. We are still dealing with Sierra Limited, who sells appliances and is considering a 100,000 Rand investment with the following cash flows. And once again, assume a weighted average cost of capital of 8%. So guys, the investment has a cost of 100,000 Rand. So we have a cash outflow at the beginning of year one. Now, please note how these columns work. This is the end of year one, end of year two, end of year three, end of year four, meaning that year zero is the beginning of year one. Also, please note, if this is the end of year two, it could also be seen as the beginning of year three. And if this is the end of year three, it can also be seen as the beginning of year four. So you must understand how these columns work so that you make sure you put your cash flows in the correct column. So in this example, we have an outflow of 100,000 Rand right at the beginning of year one. We then have an inflow of 25,000, an inflow of 38,000, 45,000, and 56,000 over the 4-year period. And we need to calculate the net present value. So one way you can perform this calculation is using the cash flow function on your calculator. So please remember, if you use your calculator, you must show your calculator steps. So you are going to input all of these as cash flows. 100,000 Rand negative, cash flow. 25,000 positive, cash flow. 38,000 positive, cash flow. 45,000 positive, cash flow. 56,000 positive, cash flow. Make I 8% and work out your net present value. As an alternative, instead of using the cash flow function on your calculator, you could also use your present value factors. So as a recap, how do we calculate these factors? You make your future value 1, N over here is going to be 2, I is 8%, and you compute your present value. Or if we look at year 3, your future value is 1, N is 3, I is 8%, and once again compute your present value. And then if you use the factors, you just take the cash flow, you multiply it by the factor so that you can get your present value. You then just add together all of these cash flows over here and you work out your net present value. Then how do we determine whether the company should invest in this project or not? Here's my decision criteria just below. If the investment has a negative net present value, it should be rejected, because if it has a negative net present value, that means it's going to decrease the value of the company. However, if it has a positive net present value, it should be accepted because that means it's going to increase the value of the company. So in our example above, we calculated a positive net present value. So this investment will cause the value of the company to increase by 32,606 Rand. So therefore, it should be accepted. So if you have a positive NPV, accept. If you have a negative NPV, reject. Then lastly, if you are faced with a situation where a company has many different investment opportunities. So for example, either they can go for investment A or investment B or investment C, you should then select the investment with the highest net present value. Now, please note, this means that we are dealing with a situation where the investments are mutually exclusive. So that means the company does not have enough money to invest in all of the alternatives. They can only pick one of the investments. And if they can only select one of the investments, then they should select the one with the highest net present value. If the company has enough money available and they would like to invest in all of them, we are then dealing with an independent investment, and that means that all projects that have a positive net present value should be accepted, and all projects with a negative net present value should be rejected. So guys, please note, if they are independent, that means we can accept or reject either or both. So the company has enough money to invest in all of the projects if they want to. However, if it's mutually exclusive, that means that only one of the alternatives can be accepted. Now, linked to that, where we have investments that are mutually exclusive. So in other words, what does it mean if they are mutually exclusive? It means that the company only has limited funds available for investment purposes, so they can't select all of the alternatives. Only one of the investments can be selected. So in other words, the best alternative must be selected using the capital that is available. Now, it's very important when we are comparing two different investments and the company can only select one of those investments, we need to make sure that these investments are comparable in terms of the investment lifespan and also in terms of the initial cost. So first, guys, we are going to look at the investment lifespan in a little bit more detail. So how do we deal with a situation where our investments have different lifespans? We calculate an annual equivalent for each investment, and we select the alternative that has the higher annual equivalent. Let's look at an example just below. Parrot Limited requires a new machine for their production process, and they have identified the following possibilities, and only one of the machines can be purchased. So if only one of the machines can be purchased, we are dealing with a mutually exclusive decision. So you can see machine A has a positive net present value of 280,000 Rand, and machine B has a positive net present value of 350,000 Rand. Machine A has a useful life of 3 years, and machine B has a useful life of 5 years. Now, if you go back to the decision criteria on the previous page, I said to you, when we have a mutually exclusive investment decision, when we can only select one of the investments, you should select the investment with the higher net present value. So in this example, machine B has a higher net present value, so I would conclude invest in machine B because it has a higher net present value. However, the problem that we are sitting with is these machines are not comparable in terms of their useful lives. Machine B has a much longer useful life than machine A. So because we are dealing with investments that have different lifespans, we need to calculate an annual equivalent. And only after we've calculated the annual equivalent, we can then determine which machine the company should invest in. So please note a little bit of additional information They have a weighted average cost of capital of 9%. And you can see just below, machine B has a higher net present value. However, it is incorrect to conclude that machine B should be selected over machine A because the machines have different useful lives. An annual equivalent, therefore, needs to be calculated before a comparison can be made. So first, let's just look at machine A. We know that machine A has a net present value of 280,000 Rand. So please, you include that in your calculator as your present value. We know that the company has a weighted average cost of capital of 9%, so that is I. And we also know that machine A has a useful life of 3 years, so N is 3. Then you compute your payments. And you have calculated the annual equivalent, because remember guys, your payment is an annual amount. We've calculated the annual equivalent for machine A. We now need to calculate the annual equivalent for machine B. So for machine B, we have a net present value of 350,000 Rand. So that is my present value. The weighted average cost of capital is 9%, so that is I. And machine B has a useful life of 5 years, so N is 5. And you compute your payments. And because these are both annual amounts, this is now comparable. So we can see machine A has the higher annual equivalent, and because it has the higher annual equivalent, machine A should be purchased. So please note, guys, where we have investments with different lifespans, calculate an annual equivalent and you select the alternative with the higher annual equivalent. We then need to look at how you deal with a situation where the investments have different initial costs. So please note, when the investments have different initial costs, an NPV index needs to be calculated. And we calculate the NPV index by taking the present value and dividing by the investment cost. And by doing this, we calculate the present value per 1 Rand investment. So then it doesn't matter that the investments have different initial costs because we are expressing this for every 1 Rand investment. And then it is comparable. Now, guys, your calculation is going to depend on whether the investments are divisible or not. If the investments are divisible, you are then going to select the alternative with the higher net present value index. And if they are not divisible, you are going to focus on maximizing the absolute net present value. Now, what do I mean by an investment being divisible? If an investment is divisible, it can be split into smaller components. So in other words, instead of investing in the entire project or the entire investment, you can only make a partial investment. So you can maybe invest 40% or 60%. On the other hand, if it's not divisible, then it cannot be split into smaller components. So an example of an investment that is not divisible would be if the company is looking at buying a machine. If you are looking at buying a machine, either the company is going to buy the machine or they're not going to buy the machine. They're not going to buy 50% of the machine, for example. So that is an example where we are dealing with an investment that is not divisible. It cannot be split into smaller components. If you invest the total amount. However, if it's divisible, that means you don't have to invest the total amount. You can invest smaller amounts or even more if you want to. This will be a little bit clearer when we look at the example on the next page. So I suggest let's look at that example and then we can come back to this discussion to make sure you're happy with this. Parrot Limited has 450,000 Rand excess cash available for investment purposes. They have identified the following investment possibilities. So we have investment A with a cost of 300,000 Rand and a net present value of 280,000 Rand, and investment B with a cost of 450,000 Rand and a net present value of 350,000. So we can see Parrot does not have enough money available to select both investments. If they wanted to go for both investments, that's going to cost them 750,000 Rand. They've only got 450,000 Rand excess cash available. So they can only select one of the investments, meaning that we are dealing with a mutually exclusive decision once again. And when we are dealing with a mutually exclusive decision, I said to you, you should select the alternative with the higher net present value. So if we look at this, investment B has a higher net present value. However, it's not correct to conclude that the company should invest in investment B because these investments are not comparable in terms of their initial costs. And the logic is because investment A is cheaper than investment B, if the company decides to select investment A, they will still have an extra 150,000 Rand available in order to invest elsewhere. However, if they select investment B, this will be their only investment. Now, guys, I said to you the calculation is going to depend on whether these investments are divisible or not. So first, I want you to assume that the investments are divisible. So if we go back to the previous page, if the investments are divisible, that means they can be broken up into smaller components. And I'm going to then calculate the net present value index and select the alternative with the higher net present value index. How do I calculate my net present value index? I take the present value and I divide by the investment cost. So let's first look at the calculation for investment A. We know that investment A has a net present value of 280,000 Rand. But please note that is the net present value. I want you to go back in your lecture notes to the first example where we calculated our net present value. Please note that the net present value is after deducting the original investment cost. On the other hand, my present value ignores this original investment cost. So if I want the present value, I'm just going to add back the investment cost of 100,000 Rand, and that will give me my present value. The net present value is after deducting the investment cost of 100,000 Rand. If we look at the definition for the net present value, it is the present value of my future cash flows discounted using the company's weighted average cost of capital less the cost of the investment. So when I deduct the cost of the investment, that gives me the net present value. If I just want the present value, you should not deduct the cost of the investment. So working backwards, how am I going to get the present value for investment A? I'm going to take my net present value and I'm going to add back the investment cost. And if I add back the investment cost, that will leave me with my present value. In order to calculate the NPV index, I take that present value, I divide by the investment cost, and I've got my NPV index. Let's do the same thing for investment B. I know for investment B that I have a net present value of 350,000 Rand. If I want the present value, I just need to add back the investment cost of 450,000 Rand. So that gives me a present value of 800,000. We divide by the investment cost of 450,000 and we calculate the net present value index. Now remember I said to you on the previous page, the net present value index is just my present value per 1 Rand investment. So this is now comparable. For every 1 Rand that I invest, what is my present value? And because these investments are divisible, I am going to select the alternative with the highest net present value index. So we can conclude investment A has the higher net present value index, and therefore investment A should be purchased. Now, instead of just studying this as a rule, I want you to understand the logic behind this calculation. We did this assuming that the investments are divisible. So that means instead of investing 300,000 Rand in investments A, the company can invest less money or they can invest more money. And I know this because the investments are divisible. So what would happen to this net present value over here if the company invested 450,000 Rand instead of 300,000 Rand? So please note the net present value of 280,000 Rand is based on investing 300,000 Rand. So what happens if they invest an additional 150,000 Rand in order to bring them to a total investment of 450,000? If they invest an extra 150,000 Rand, so that is half of what their current investment is, then the net present value should increase by 140,000 Rand. And my logic is that is also half. So if I invest 150,000 instead of 300,000, I'm investing half of that amount, then the net present value will also be half. Meaning, if I invest an additional 150,000 Rand, my investment cost is going to increase from 300,000 to 450,000, and my net present value is going to increase from 280,000 to 420,000 because I'm going to have an additional 140,000 Rand. So you can see that discussion just below. Because the investments are divisible, Parrot could invest a further 150,000 Rand, which would yield a net present value of 140,000. So if they invest 450,000 Rand in investment A, this will then give them a net present value of 420,000 Rand. The original 280 plus the additional 140,000 from above. And we can then see that this is higher than the net present value of 350,000, which they would make on investment B. Investment B with a cost of 450,000 gives me an NPV of 350,000. However, if I spend 450,000 Rand on investment A, that gives me an NPV of 420,000. So that's why if the projects are divisible, you calculate the net present value index and you select the alternative with the highest net present value index. On the other hand, if the projects are not divisible, you then can't split the projects into smaller components, meaning that we can only invest 300,000 Rand in investment A. We can't invest 450,000 Rand, or we can't invest less if we want to. If we go for investment A, it's not divisible, we have to invest 300,000. If we go for investment B, it's not divisible, we have to invest 450,000. So guys, please note, if it's not divisible, you do not calculate the NPV index. Instead, you just focus on maximizing the absolute net present value. So which investment had the higher absolute net present value? Investment B. So you can see just below, assuming that the investments are not divisible, we should then select investment B because it has the highest absolute net present value. So even though its net present value index is lower than that of investment A cannot be increased because the investments are not divisible. So the company will then be better off by investing in investment B. So please note, guys, just to wrap this up, I said to you over here when we looked at our decision criteria, if the projects are mutually exclusive, meaning we can only select one of those projects, we should select the alternative with the higher net present value. But please note, when we are making this comparison, we must make sure that the investments are comparable in terms of their lifespan and in terms of their initial cost. If they have different lifespans, we calculated an annual equivalent and we selected the alternative with the higher annual equivalent. If they have different initial costs, we needed to check if the projects were divisible or not. If they are divisible, we calculate the net present value index. We select the alternative with the higher net present value index. If they are not divisible, we select the alternative with the highest net present value. So please make sure whenever you are making a comparison where you have mutually exclusive investments that they are comparable in terms of their lifespan and their initial cost.